So now we're going to talk about types of risks. Start with a cartoon. We advise all of our clients not to hire the most brilliant managers. Risk varies inversely with knowledge. Otherwise, there would be many more very wealthy university professors. Always did like that cartoon. I actually was in an educational class where we were tasked with basically designing the educational system for a new country. And one of the students came up with the idea of, well, let's get the smartest and best people in their fields to teach the classes. And someone else then commented, well, what if they're really smart and they're really good in their field, but they can't actually teach? And that's when the professor interrupted and said, we call them professors. And I always thought that was hilarious. I wish I was able to take more classes from that professor. But first, we're going to start with capital risk. This is the risk of losing principal, of losing money. If you invest, you always will have this. You can always lose money. There are no guarantees. Business and credit risk. These are very related, but these are two separate risks. Many of the times when I write them as the two, with a slash in between, I mean they're the same. Business and credit risk are not the same. They are different, but they're very related. They're the risk that the issuer is going to go out of business or default on the debt, usually because they're going out of business. Several years ago, I was looking to buy stock. I was looking to make an investment. So I did my research and decided I was going to buy Toys R Us. For those of you who aren't aware, Toys R Us is going through or has gone through bankruptcy and is not doing very well. So it wasn't a very good idea for me to invest in Toys R Us 10 years ago because the business risk of the stock is that if the business has some problems, if there's some mistake the business does or whatever happens, the business could go out of business. And that's business risk relating to the common stock of the company. But I didn't buy common stock in Toys R Us 10 years ago. I had a change of heart. I decided I was looking more for income. So I wanted to buy a corporate bond. And I did my research and went, I'm going to buy a corporate bond in Toys R Us. What am I, a one-trick pony here. Looking at it now, I'm not going to be likely getting all of the interest and principal payments I was expecting on that bond. Because the credit risk related to that Toys R Us bond, now that the business of Toys R Us is having trouble, their credit's going down, the bonds aren't likely to be paying, the value in them is going to go down, but that's credit risk. Business risk relates to common stock, credit risk relates to bonds. But otherwise, they're basically the same idea, that something's going to happen to the issuer, and they're going to basically be going out of business, defaulting on the debt. Your ownership's going to go down or your interest is going to cease. Things like that are the consequences. Now we have currency and exchange risk. This is a risk that exchange rates will change and affect the investment. This is only going to really exist on foreign investments. You're not going to have currency exchange risk in United States investments. It's only when you're going outside into different currencies because the value of them can fluctuate. And if they go up or down, that's going to change the value of the dollar to that currency, which is what that stock is valued in, which is also beyond just the business or credit or whatever other risks that company might have. You also have that if exchange value changes, that might also negatively or potentially positively affect your investment. Most of these risks are not necessarily negative. They could be positive. Business and credit, unlikely to really see an upside in there unless you're sort of like buying into a really bad company and then all of a sudden it turns around. Well, I guess that's sort of business credit risk, but not really. Most of these are potentially positive. It's just a risk. It's something that we don't know is going to happen. Could be positive, could be negative. Do you want to take that chance? Minimize, maximize the risks. Up to the investor, up to you. Purchasing power or inflation risk. These are the same things. I always like thinking of it more as purchasing power risk because there's another I risk that's also important, making sure we don't get inflation and interest mixed up. Purchasing power is the risk in fixed income securities that over the time, the value of that principal is losing purchasing power. It's not just on fixed income securities, it's on fixed income investments. The greatest risk in fixed annuities is inflation. I bought a bond or a preferred stock or a fixed annuity or something that was paying me $10,000 a year. And I bought this 20 years ago. Well, 20 years ago, $10,000 a year would buy whatever $10,000 could 20 years ago. I'm still getting $10,000 a year now. It didn't go up. It's fixed income. It's a fixed amount. It doesn't increase. I'm still getting $10,000 a year. Can't buy quite as much with that $10,000. That's the idea of the purchasing power is going down because of inflation. $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. Interest rate risk is a risk in changes in interest rates will affect the security. The longer the maturity, the more generally it is going to be affected. But the longer the duration, the more it will be affected. If they don't give you duration, look for maturity. This is also on fixed income. Now these get a little bit weird. There is one fixed income that does not have inflation risk, and that are TIPS, the Treasury Inflation Protected Security. All fixed income securities or investments that you expect, plan, maybe, might, potentially want to sell will have interest rate risk. When interest rates change, the price of fixed securities change. When interest rates go up, the price goes down. When interest rates go down, the prices go up. But if you do not ever plan on selling them, then technically there is no interest rate risk. If you buy a bond that you're going to keep for 10 years until maturity, and there's no way you're going to sell it, you just want that income, you're fully planning on it maturing and all of that, you never plan on selling it, then the fact that interest rate risk affects the market price isn't going to bother you because you're never interested in the market price. You're going to get the $1,000 at maturity regardless of what the market price is. Interest rate does not affect the return of principal at maturity. So if we look at the question, a 10% bond maturing in 10 years, an 8% bond maturing in 5 years, a 12% bond maturing in 3 years, or a 9% bond maturing in 20 years, and we're asking which is going to be most or which is going to be least affected by interest rate risks, well, we need to look for, there's no duration, it doesn't say anything about duration, so we need to look for the longest maturity. The longest maturity is going to be most affected. The shortest maturity is going to be least affected. The 12% bond maturing in 3 years is the shortest, that's least affected. The 9% bond maturing in 20 years is most affected. Now a 10% bond maturing in 10 years with a duration of 9 years, an 8% bond maturing in 5 years with a duration of 3 years, a 12% bond maturing in 3 years with a duration of 2 years, or a 9% bond maturing in 20 years with a duration of 8 years. Now we have a duration. Now it doesn't matter what maturity is, we're looking for the longest duration, the shortest duration. The 9 years has the most exposure to interest rate risks. The 2 years has the least exposure. Duration in its simplest idea is basically how long the bond is going to take to pay for itself. If maturities are equal, the one with the higher interest rate risk will pay for itself sooner. So it's going to have higher interest rate is going to pay for itself sooner. So it's going to have a shorter duration and be less susceptible to changes in interest rates. Reinvestment risk. This is the risk that at maturity that you won't be able to put your money back and get as good an investment at a similar risk level. That you're going to have to, if my bonds are maturing and I still want $10,000 a year, I may have to go into riskier bonds in order to get it, or I may not be able to get it at all. Ginnie Maes, callable securities, CMOs, CDOs are common examples that will have this risk because those will actually suffer from something called, that we'll discuss a bit, called prepayment risk. The idea that it could be prepaid. And when it gets prepaid, Ginnie Maes are backed by mortgages. CMOs are backed by mortgages. We talked about callable securities as sort of refinancing debt. CDOs are basically the same idea as mortgages, except it's a different type of debt. It's not a mortgage, it's a different type. When are people going to refinance their debt? When interest rates are going down. And so if you, as a fixed income buyer, you're getting your money back, when interest rates are going down, you now have to reinvest in a down interest rate environment. So it sort of compounds it there with some of these securities. Liquidity risk. This is the risk that the investment can't be turned into cash quickly at the current market value. These are minimum or non-existent exchange-listed securities, government securities, mutual funds, and similar. A few years ago, I went and purchased $500,000 in IBM stock. Today, it's worth $250,000. I lost half of my money. And I want to go and get my money out. I'm tired of waiting. It's not going back up. I want to get my money out. How fast can I sell my IBM stock? Pretty much. Because there's a lot of market makers. I can easily sell it and I'll get my $250,000. I invested $500,000. I'm getting $250,000. Liquidity has nothing to do with safety. Has nothing to do with loss of premium or loss of principal. Nothing to do with that. Simply, can you turn it into cash quickly at the current market prices? Certain investments, you can't really. Let's think, instead of buying $500,000 in IBM, I bought $500,000 house. Same idea, it's now worth $250,000. I lost half my value. Well, how fast can I sell that house and get $250,000 for it? Might take some time. Certain specialty investments have major liquidity problems. Real estate, hedge funds, and similar potentially are totally illiquid, that you really can't sell it. Hedge funds particularly, their manager may say no liquidations. You cannot get out for the next 6 months, year, or however long. This is technically different than marketability. Marketability is merely, can you try and sell it? They're related, but check out the animation on risks. I go into, I think, a little more detail in some of them on there, and you'll see the details I go into about marketability versus liquidity. When you review your retirement fund and wet your pants and cry, that's liquidity. Market risk. This is the risk that the market will go down. It cannot be diversified away. We're going to talk about diversification in the next unit. It is a systematic risk. That is why it can't be diversified away. Systematic risks can't be diversified away. One of the ideas that I've seen that I sort of like the idea of is that in certain ways, interest rate risk can be thought of as the market risk in bonds. That if interest rates go up, all bonds go down. If interest rates go down, all bonds go up. It's a risk of the market in bonds. Political risk. The risk in foreign investments that the political climate changes. This is also known as sovereign risk. In the United States and other westernized democracies, there really is no political risk. Now, if you look at countries like Somalia that have no government, if the government, part of the government's job is to protect business interests, to help foster growth and business and things like that, if there is no government or the government's under threat, potentially going to be overthrown, there's additional risks in there. Now, if some people have seen or heard of, there is tremendous amounts of investments in some parts of Africa that have considerable political risk, that the governments may be overthrown. But while they're doing it, they're able to make a lot of money on it. Some of them are actually benefiting the people of Africa. Many, regrettably, are not. But I've seen some of these micro loans that are phenomenal. I've given to some of them where they're basically going and trying to lend $20 to people in Africa. That's it, a $20 loan where they're paying $2 a week in interest or something, $1 a week in interest. Which, when you look at it and go, wow, that is insanely high interest. Well, for $20, they can go and buy 5 bags of rice. They take it back to the village. They sell those 5 bags of rice for $40. They give $1 in interest. Now they have $39, and they go and buy 8 bags of rice. And they bring them back, and they have more money, and then they go and buy 14 bags of rice. And they build a business off of these micro loans. But the returns are actually reasonably solid, pretty high, and it's doing good. But there's political risk there, because something could happen to the banking issues in some of those cases because of the wars and things. So you get what you pay for. With additional risk, generally comes additional returns. But political risk is only generally going to be there in sort of lesser developed countries because of the potential violence and wars that could overthrow governments. Prepayment risk. As I mentioned earlier, this is a risk that the principal will be returned before the investor wants. It's present in callable securities, Ginnie Maes and CMOs. And the problem is when these are prepaid, it's because interest rates are going down. So now you've got to reinvest in a down market. Prepayment and reinvestment risk go hand in hand. Anything with prepayment risk also has reinvestment risk. Non-systematic risks. Well, we talked about systematic being market risk and interest rate risk. These are non-systematic risks, or risks that can be diversified away. Systematic risks cannot be, but non-systematic risks can be. Simply purchasing more issuers. If back 10, 20 years ago when I bought my Toys R Us for a bad decision, if instead I bought a couple of others as well, yeah, I might have lost money on Toys R Us, but I would have made money on the others, and so hopefully my portfolio still would have gone up, even if the business risk of one of them would have taken out if I just put all of my eggs in that one basket. Legislative risk. This is the risk that laws will change, primarily tax laws. That's the big law that they ask about in this test if they're going to ask for legislative risk. Make sure you know that legislative risk is taxes. Taxes are a legislative risk. Regulatory risk is the risk that a regulation from a federal agency will negatively impact the investment. The FDA, the FCC, the EPA. I talk about a friend from college who actually very much liked this herbal supplement called ephedra. It's used for a lot of things. All of those energy supplements back from early 2000s, everybody had ephedra in it. The problem with ephedra is it's one step removed from crystal meth. So in early 2000s, the FDA came in and said, no more ephedra sales. That was a regulation that was set that took off all those companies that made energy supplements. All of them had ephedra in it. It's a natural supplement. It's only when you purify it down and go through the chemical process that it's really dangerous. It's sort of like we eat poppy seeds all the time. It's not heroin, just eating poppy seeds. You got to purify it down to get something dangerous. Same idea with ephedra, except it was too easy. I have no idea of how you do any of this, but I think poppies require a little more than just a trailer, whereas unfortunately, turning ephedra into meth was pretty simple. So the FDA came and banned it, and all of those companies suffered. But there may have been some energy supplement companies that didn't like ephedra, that didn't use ephedra. They're the only ones on the market now. So the regulatory risk could be beneficial when a new regulation comes down that hurts one part of an industry or some businesses, maybe benefiting others that were already sort of prepared for it, that may have actually even been losing money to prepare for it. Some of these climate change and those types of regulations, some companies are doing it before it's a regulation, costing them more money, and then when the regulation comes down, well, they're already set. Their competitors are the ones that are out right now, and so it's, again, pros and cons. Call risk. The risk that a securities issuer will call the security, returning the principal and ending income. We talked about this when we talked about callable preferred stock and callable bonds. That's basically what these are. It's only on preferred stocks or bonds that are listed, but it does come with a higher income on the bonds and preferred stock. They only get called during falling interest rates. This is what I was telling you on that. But this is why they pay more. Risk and return. If there is an additional risk, the investor is expecting additional return, compensation for that. Callable securities have call risk. That's why the issuer needs to pay the investor more to purchase them. That brings us to this end on risks. There are many other types of risks, many of which you are never going to need to know. But if you do start searching on Google, be prepared. But again, these are the most likely to be tested, and you very much want to understand what these are and any that are related, like the interest and credit and inflation are all on fixed income, which ones are going to be on common stock, things like that. Reach out if you have any questions, and I'll see you again shortly.